Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to this, what has become an annual event when editors and authors talk about the publication process. This afternoon we have 5 editors who are going to be talking about publishing special kinds of papers. Each editor will present and we will have time at the end for questions. So please save your questions until the end. This session is being recorded and may be posted on the MNRS website. So when you ask questions, please come to the mic and we will also probably repeat your questions just to make sure that they're recorded. So this afternoon we are fortunate to have Rita Pickler, Christine Kovac, Sue Henley, myself, and Elaine Miller all talking with you about publishing special papers. And I think we'll move right on to our presentations.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. We have chosen some topics of papers that we think may be different challenges, present different kinds of challenges for you as you're publishing things. And for those of you who were at Julie Fairman's talk yesterday, I assume most everybody was there at her wonderful keynote yesterday. She was talking yesterday about some of the great historical theory papers that nurses of a certain age read during our PhD programs and when they were fresh. So we remember how important those theory papers were to us. And the truth is that we still do need, I'm gonna press here, we still do need papers that are theory papers that are thought-provoking, because those are the papers that help us to expand our existing understanding and to think about things in a conceptual and theoretical way. I love empirical work and I like publishing research papers, but indeed I do believe that we need to have papers that drive theory forward and theory thinking forward. And so what I'm going to focus on today are 2 types of theoretical papers: concept analyses and theoretical models or theory critiques. So concept analyses, many of you, if your students, may be doing these types of concept analyses in your PhD programs in particular. You may have done a concept analysis as a prelude to your own dissertation work or to your study that you were conducting. And concept analyses are not published by all journals. I'm a journal editor for the Journal of Advanced Nursing, and we do publish concept analyses, as do a number of other journals, but not all journals want concept analysis papers. And the analyses that we want to see as editors are those that extend the work that's already been done. A concept is not necessarily of interest to the reading public just because it's of interest to you. And so you have to think about what is the concept and is it relevant to today's current thinking or to our forward-thinking ideas. You want to be able to talk about a concept within the context of what is already existing in our knowledge, so within some other conceptual model or theory. And I do refer you to a paper by Draper published in the Journal of Advanced Nursing, a critique of concept analysis. He raised some issues about whether or not concept analyses were really beneficial, if you will, to our forward thinking. That paper received some critique from some interesting persons, Jan Morse and also Jan Diedrich and Kathy Knaffel wrote a commentary in response to that paper. And all of that is interesting reading that I think if you're writing a concept analysis, it may help you in thinking about those things. Now, theoretical model or theory critique papers are slightly different. Here we're looking for an analysis or a critique of an existing theory that extends that theoretical model beyond where it currently is. And again, what's important about that is that it really does make an extension of knowledge and is not simply a repeat of what is already known about the theory. So how important are these types of papers to journals or science? Well, I can't speak about all journals. So I'm only talking about the Journal of Advanced Nursing here, but you can look for these same kinds of statistics, if you will, on probably any journal's website. So Jan gets about 1,000 or so submissions a year, about 90 papers a month come into Jan. So it publishes quite a few of those papers, 22% acceptance rate. But then look at the types of papers that the journal is actually publishing. And so when you get down to how many concept analysis papers are we talking about, we're talking about 11 papers a year on average that are a concept analysis. So it's difficult to get a concept analysis published, just to be frank, because the bar is high. And we don't make a lot of space for them. We don't get a lot of them, but we also want to be sure that the ones that are being published are high quality. Same with discussion papers, which is where Jan puts its theoretical papers, the theory critiques and so forth, those types of papers. And that's a little bit more, it's about 20 papers or so a year that fit into the discussion paper column for us. So it's not a genre, if you will, that receives a lot of press. But there is a market, certainly, for those papers. Again, what makes it a good paper is in how you plan and actually write that paper. Choose your topic carefully. Again, things that are interesting to me may be of no interest to anybody else. You need to think about what that topic is and whether or not it's new, it's innovative, whether or not there will be widespread interest. Then you want to choose your journal carefully, because so many journals will not publish concept analyses or will not publish theory critiques. So don't spend your time submitting to a journal that may not be interested in those kinds of papers. Once you choose a journal, be sure you adhere to the guidelines for writing those papers. I think all the editors up here would agree that nothing gets a paper out of review quicker than one that fails to follow the journal's writing guidelines, right? Follow the guidelines. Jan has, I think it's 60-some pages of text that are author guidelines. But all you have to do is click on one link that says concept analysis, and it takes you to the pages that gives you all the specific instructions. So follow those instructions carefully. If you're doing a concept analysis in particular, follow all the steps. There are, in fact, very clear guidelines for what a concept analysis should look like. Don't leave steps out. And if you've reviewed the literature for your concept analysis, which you have undoubtedly done for a good concept analysis, consider following some of the integrative review or systematic literature review guidelines to make sure that you haven't biased your own reporting of what that concept analysis is about. So you can integrate that systematic review framework within the context of your concept analysis. And if you're critiquing a theory or discussing other aspects of a theory or its application, be very explicit about what you are critiquing and why it matters. It's especially important that your concept analysis or theory critique takes us to beyond where we currently are. It is insufficient to leave us where we currently exist. So your recommendations or the ending of your paper, your conclusion about what we should take home about your concept analysis or theory critique should take us beyond what we currently know. It's insufficient to say we need more work. Of course we do. But be specific about what that work should be. And tell us how that work is going to happen, how we're going to get beyond what we currently know to where it is that we want to go. Some common Weaknesses of these papers, again, a poorly written paper. It's a fatal flaw of almost any paper if it's not well written. So write it well, have somebody critique it for you, make sure you followed those guidelines. That frustrates editors no end when those guidelines are not followed. Be sure that your concept or your idea is original. It is a weakness for things to be presented that are not new, again, not well delineated, not carefully situated within the context of what is already known. That's what's critical about these papers. And theory critiques that are just up in the air and not applied to any sort of meaningful situations are also not helpful. So those are the kinds of papers that our reviewers don't particularly rate well. We want those things to be very specific. So again, just because it's interesting to you, you need to make it interesting to the audience that the journal is serving. That's what's really important. So again, it's important to carefully consider the standalone potential of your paper. It can't be published without it being able to stand alone on its own merits. So think about that as you choose your topic and your journal.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about methods papers. I'm the editor of the journal Research in Gerontological Nursing. So let's just think for a minute about where have our methods come from historically. When you think about it, a lot of what we've learned about measurement comes from psychology. A lot of what we've learned about how to do an intervention research or an experiment comes from agriculture. A lot of what we've learned about qualitative methods comes from several other disciplines. And I think that as we have gained, and that makes sense, it's perfectly fine to use, nobody owns those methods, and those disciplines historically developed before the science of nursing developed, so that all completely makes sense. But as we have become more clear in what our identity is as a discipline and what our science is, I think we're really gaining our voice and we're learning which of these methods work for us and which of them need to be tweaked in different ways. And that is all good news. That is all excellent. So we really like methods papers. I think that we're one of the disciplines that really needs more methods papers that are pushing the boundaries. So I'm starting with weaknesses. What are the common weaknesses that we see in methods papers? One is the topic's been overdone. It's just been done to death. We have many, many papers out there on how to recruit different samples. And if you see, do a literature search. Have there been so many things done on that yours won't make any really new contribution? Save yourself some time. Don't write up that manuscript. Another thing is where people end up, they're new researchers, they do a study, they have methods problems, and they feel like, well, I have to get a publication out of this, so I'm just going to tell people my problems that I had. And unless you're really talking about new solutions and things that are really going to help a wide readership, it's probably not something that's going to get a positive review. Other methods papers are just useful to such a small readership. It's probably not going to be reviewed very well. And those that read like a textbook, if we can really find that information readily in a textbook, it's not something that should become a methods paper. It needs to be something that's really new information. So, what are research journals looking for? What's new? Those are the big things. Think about that. Big data is new. We have a lot of folks talking about pragmatic clinical trials. There's a lot of questions about those methods and are those going to be valid methods or not? There's a lot of things to be worked out there. technology, we all know, is like blasting into both interventions and data collection methods. So think about how we can improve the quality of the knowledge, in order for our practice and our science and our solutions to patient problems to be solved. What is the view that we have to have? What are the methods that are going to get us those answers? And the article needs to relate to that journal's readership. So I looked at research in gerontological nursing, and I pulled out some of the methods, things that we've done. And I think it's helpful just to look at this list for a minute, because you'll see these are new. Adapting telemonitoring technology use for older adults. Well, probably a lot of people who read our journal would be interested in that. A statistician wrote an article on how to achieve a national sample of nursing homes, balancing probability techniques and practicalities. A comparison of accelerometer accuracy in older adults. If you're thinking about doing that kind of research, that kind of a manuscript is gold for you, because you can get that quick information and then you don't have to do the pilot study. Somebody's already done that for you. Now here's one on sampling, challenges in recruiting aging women Holocaust survivors. Now this is a niche. It probably does not relate to a huge amount of our readership, but it was such a unique article that was well written that we took that one. A comparison of multiple cognitive assessment tools in a nursing home population. Again, comparing multiple tools. If you're looking at doing a study with that population, finding that sort of a recent updated comparison is gold for you. Psychometric evaluation of a self-efficacy scale, pretty standard thing. The role of emerging technologies in frailty assessment. Methodological issues in fall prevention research in nursing homes. Now, wouldn't you like to read that if you were a beginning fall researcher? That's probably coming from a very experienced researcher. And then we did a state of the science paper on measurement of quality of life outcomes. So, what are the types of methods papers that we see? Well, think about the different steps of analysis and research. So sampling and recruitment, we've already talked a little bit about. What about non-experimental studies? What are the big issues with those? Well, big issues with non-experimental are how do we control for potentially confounding variables, and what are the new techniques for managing that? In experimental research, what are we doing about fidelity? There are quite a few articles out there on maintaining fidelity. We developed a technique that we published using branching simulations, which uses technology and allows us to get rid of some of our fidelity problems prior to ever entering one subject, one active participant into the study. So that's really helpful, because with an intention to treat, you can't say, well, we screwed up on these folks, we're gonna get rid of those. Intention to treat means they're included, even if they didn't get the intervention. Unequal groups. In experimental research, we use random assignment, but what are other techniques that we use to assure that the groups are equal? And one of the big things is timing of measures. It's very hard to know how do we decide on the timing of measures, and what are minimum clinically important differences for these measures. So that's just an example of a few topics. In terms of intervention, I think one of the big topics that we're working on now with our types of interventions is how to conceptualize dose and how to measure dose. I know I've worked with this a lot in my intervention studies, and it's very challenging. And I think this is an area where we really need to strengthen our science. So people who figure that out and are willing to publish that, I think that's very marketable. if you're describing interventions, and we have Vicki here, Khan, who has just written a lot on this, I think looking at the interface and being able to describe very clearly the interface between the theoretical components, those specific intervention components, and the outcomes, and explain how that was developed and the mechanisms of action is useful for people who are beginning to develop interventions. One of the things that I think is particularly marketable and always gets a high impact factor are the qualitative methods and mixed methods pieces, because the textbooks right now on those topics are not sufficient, and people are developing new things in those areas. So I think those, if you're doing something new in that area, think about that. If you are writing a methods manuscript and it's survey research, I have put up a couple of references here. There's a very old 1985 article in Nursing Research on Norbeck by Norbeck that sort of gives you the nuts and bolts of how to write a pretty typical psychometric measurement article. And then Robin Froman has written a couple of editorials in RINA. So before you embark on that, I would suggest that just as a basic foundation, you read those. Clinical measurement procedures are tools. We know that a lot of our tools are not really that amenable to traditional psychometric evaluation. So how are we measuring the reliability and validity of those tools? And then our biobehavioral measures. We have a lot of measures, and we don't want it to be the Wild West out there with our biobehavioral measures. Otherwise, we're really going to have junk science. So I think we need a lot more out there about how can these be used, either as independent variables, as outcome measures, as moderating variables, mediating variables. And then new analytics, working with statisticians on analytics. I just came back from reviewing for NIH study section, and some of the folks that are doing the best work out there, where you just get so excited when you're reading these proposals, they are people who are slicing the view of a problem differently. Like, we've been looking at this problem and not solving it in this way, and we're in these boxes. And they sort of say, you know, we sliced it completely differently, and we've developed these measures for measuring it differently. And they have years as a team of developing studies that justify that this approach is now worthy of big major R01 funding. And I'll tell you, those studies rock because they're changing, they're pushing the boundaries. So I think if you know people from other institutions, you're all studying the same things, get together at your conferences and talk about how are you dealing with measurement of this? How are you dealing with these fidelity issues? How are you dealing with this matching of groups or confounding variables or analytics? And see what you can come up with. Okay, so here's the list that we had up before, and we're going to look at this in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about a priori planning, because the best way to think about doing measurement methods manuscripts is to do that a priori planning, to think way ahead of time, not to sort of get in the midst of the study, near completion of the study, and say, well, maybe we could turn this into a methods manuscript. So sometimes we are doing methods work as small pilot studies that get us closer to our full proposal, but other times we're doing it once we've done a study. So think about when you are planning a study, a research proposal, what are the publications that are going to come out of that? Who's going to be the first author on those? And are there any methods pieces that we can do? And do we need to collect more information to make that a really sound, credible manuscript? So I just put up here and sort of highlighted in blue things that I thought were needed for a program of research or a proposal. So those would have been independent studies, and then ones that may have been incorporated into a study. So you see there's a mix. Formats, they tend to be shorter. We have 8 to 10 pages. They may be more procedural, more nuts and bolts things with examples, or it could be a more traditional research format. Comparing methods. I would like to say a word on proof of concept papers. That term is used differently, but proof of concept implies that you're sort of demonstrating that a principle may work or the feasibility of something may work, but it's an incomplete look. And you need those to get put into your proposal to support that the study can be done. Don't submit those for publication. Those are needed just as a little proof of concept. The sample sizes are small, the data is very incomplete. Wait until you have a fuller picture. I also will say, in terms of formats, I do like top 10 tips every once in a while. Top 10 tips for doing actigraphy, top 10 tips for something, and that tends to be a primer, like Actigraphy 101 is actually what one of my PhD students is working on now, so it's coming into my brain. You don't want a lot of those. Other quick tips, and then I'm done, is write for the audience, who that audience is. Every once in a while we'll get something from an engineer, and it's like, our readers just don't understand this. It's not been written for the understanding of the reader, and attend to structure. Look at how methods papers are structured, because they tend to be structured a little bit differently than regular research papers, not always, but sometimes. And reviewers don't like tons of surprises, and that's why that Norbeck article is very helpful. So that's it.
Thanks again for coming to our session. I'm Sue Henley, and I'm the editor of Nursing Research. At Nursing Research, we receive and we publish many papers from the exciting work that's being done as part of dissertation research. And we're really happy to have the opportunity, I'm happy to be here, to have the opportunity to share some of what we've learned about publishing at this critical juncture in an investigator's career trajectory. I first want to thank Dr. Deborah Chun, our associate editor. Last year, Deb and I worked to put together some of our thoughts about new scholars writing for publication, and you can read what we had to say in our editorial at www.nursingresearchonline.com for free, and I hope you'll take some time to look at what we had to say in the editorial. My remarks today are based on in part on our editorial, but I have some other things that I wanted to add also. So what I'll do is describe and compare authorship principles with the dissertation process and the objectives of doing a dissertation. Then secondly, I want to point out some scenarios for the purpose primarily of generating questions and discussions with you in our Q&A session, point out some conflicts that may arise when dissertation research is being published, and then talk a bit about editor involvement in the publication of dissertation research. So first of all, authorship principles. When you're talking about publishing, a key issue is who's an author. And different professional groups who work on scholarly publishing have different criteria for what constitutes an author. And in nursing research, I think we're influenced by more than one group, but in particular, the American Psychological Association. Many journals in nursing do use the APA guide to publishing. We do at Nursing Research. And it's more than a statement of how you should set up your document in Word or how you should prepare your tables. It also presents standards for the really important issues like who's an author, what should be included, how do you really link your paper with the rest of the scientific literature using referencing. So APA is very important. Increasingly in nursing, I think that the information and the standards published by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE, is figuring importantly in what we do, and so I'll talk about both. So in thinking about dissertation research, we all know when we think back to our student days, if that's what some of us are doing, or those of you who are students working on your dissertations, the student writes a dissertation, but the writing of the dissertation is not necessarily the same as the writing of a scientific paper. So who's an author from the point of view of, say, those of us who are editors? What we're looking for is who did the actual writing on the paper, and who made substantial scientific contributions to the work that's submitted to the journal. And APA and ICMJE both agree on those two criteria. They're somewhat different in some of the other priorities and principles that they put forward. For instance, in APA, the issue of the order of authors is addressed more deliberately, and that's especially important in dissertation research for some reasons that I'll get to in a minute. And in particular, and one thing that's really critical from APA, and I didn't put it on the slide, I forgot, is that they have an explicit statement that in the publication of work based on a student thesis or dissertation, almost always the student should be first author. And if you look at what has been published, and in particular if there is notation about a paper having been part of dissertation research, you'll see some author groups following that standard and some not. Differently on ICMJE, they state that all authors have to approve the final version and that all authors have to be accountable for all parts of the work that were done and have confidence in the integrity of the contributions of the co-author. So even though you as a student maybe worked closely with a statistician on your dissertation work, when you get to the point of publishing a paper as first author, you don't get to, at some point, if the work was criticized because of the statistical work, you don't get to say, oh, well, my statistician did that. Everybody has to take responsibility for everything, according to ICMJE. So then some thoughts about dissertations. A dissertation, it's a process, it's a document, it's a means to many ends simultaneously, and these ends are not necessarily all in alignment internally in each other or with the needs of professional scientific publication. So one way to think about the dissertation is a test, and students know that, I think, when they go for their final defense, where they pass the test, if they are able to walk away with all the signatures. And really, from an editorial point of view, we're not so interested in that. It doesn't matter in terms of judging the scientific quality of the work in light of the existing scientific literature, and if the work represents something that adds to the literature. So those are very different things, even though both are related to a dissertation. Another aspect about dissertation research, and this is especially with respect to this notion of the dissertation as a test, there's really fairly different standards in some ways within schools and between schools on what qualifies as acceptable dissertation research. And as advisors and as committees, I think we implicitly adjust the difficulty of the test to the abilities and to the goals that the student has for their own work. And so there's some minimal standard that's acceptable for a dissertation, but at a minimal standard end of the continuum where the dissertation is sort of an exercise set up to allow the student to demonstrate their competence in carrying out a research process that may not be producing a product that's relevant or of interest in the scientific literature. And then on the far other end of that continuum is dissertation research that is essentially game-changing for science. And of course, that's what we all would love to have. But it all exists, and I think it's important just to recognize that. And because of that wide range of approach to the dissertation research, some is suitable for publication and some may not be. Dissertation research is conducted at a really critical transition point in a person's research career. And so a lot of paradoxes get introduced. You hear the dissertation talked about as the first independent research project, and yet it's a supervised research project. And when you have that tension, then who's really the leader? And that matters when you get to the authorship step of a paper. And then another complicating issue can be, for instance, that AACN points out rightly that the research interests of a student should coincide with faculty research programs to ensure that the student gets adequate mentorship and dissertation guidance, and students should be guided by faculty members or teams of mentors with expertise in the field. And yet, if student work is really a part of their advisor's work, whose work is it? And how do you apportion credit? It really can be quite challenging, and the whole situation creates stressors and conflicts very often. So, some scenarios, just to put some ideas out there, on a secondary analysis dissertation situation, who is a primary contributor on the paper as opposed to the primary contributor to the research study. And to some extent, both of those issues need to get weighed in determining the order of authorship. Secondary analysis, some secondary analyses can be absolutely fantastic and really open up the importance and leverage the impact of a primary report, but not always. Some are exercises, and what are we doing as faculty members if we approve dissertations that are exercises and at the same time really encourage students to write a paper when the chance of success is not great? So that's an issue. In response to the editorial that Deb and I wrote, we got a letter to the editor asking, well, what should I do as advisor if a student doesn't follow through on the writing of a paper from their dissertation research? And from a scientific point of view, we really have a responsibility to publish our papers, or at least to try. But sometimes once a student graduates, they may be fatigued, they may have career goals that don't necessarily require that they be published, and so a paper just doesn't get written. But the advisor also has quite a big stake in this work, as we all know who've been advisors, and it can be fairly painful to see a paper languish. So the letter writer said, what should we do? And Deb and I wrote a response, but basically, at the end of the day, what we said is, I don't know, there are so many conflicts in this situation. And so we posted a poll on our homepage, and you can look at the poll and weigh in on what you think ought to be done. At the moment, the winning option is the advisor writes the paper with student as first author. And in selecting that, I hope people are also realizing the student first author, graduated student first author, needs to sign on and say, yes, they approve what's being done. And then finally, another sort of scenario arises with international students where the practices and expectations for publishing can vary differently from what we do in the US. And from some of those experiences, we became aware at Nursing Research, first of all, that we wanted to get out there that journal reviewers and editors are not members of dissertation committees. And that comes up sort of as a role confusion issue when there's a requirement that papers be published prior to the student graduating or as a condition for graduation. So you all know we're not on any committees. We have a different mission. And then a second topic is that journal editors and publishers do not change production schedules to accommodate academic calendars. And believe me, we've been asked, and it just isn't going to happen for a lot of practical reasons. And then finally, I guess I've talked about conflicts. I'll only point out the last one. There is right now a real shifting in the sands about in scholarly communication from an authorship model to a contributorship model. And that's something that's going to be important way beyond dissertation research. You can think of this, especially if you've seen some of these papers from major clinical trials or papers from the physical sciences where there are 100 or 1,000 authors, then that's not an authorship model, that's a contributorship model. What does that mean for us in nursing? And what's it going to mean for publication in general? And then finally, editors, we really try, at least I try to stay out of any conflicts that arise, but sometimes we do learn in the worst way about conflicts among authorship groups and between advisors and their students. The most important thing from my point of view is that everyone be very transparent in communications. I don't solve problems, but it really helps me to know what's going on so that I don't add fuel to the fire. So that's it. Thanks a lot.
I'm Vicki Kahn, Western Journal of Nursing Research, and I'm also going to be talking about publications from dissertations because we thought it was such an important topic. We thought a couple perspectives might be useful. First, the whole issue of manuscript-style dissertations. Increasingly, nursing programs are offering this alternative for students and for faculty, and there are many potential advantages for students. As a student, the person is in a learner role, and it's an ideal time to learn the skills for publication. That's the perfect time to learn how to pick what information is really relevant for a publication versus what information documents student learning. It's also the time to learn to write concisely. We have a lot of American novelists in PhD programs. And I hope you publish your novels, but not in my journal. So learning to write concisely is different, and learning to write logically sometimes is different as well. Then another issue is journal-worthy graphics. Dissertations can have pages of tables and 30 or 40 figures. And to prepare a publication, the author needs to decide what's essential for the readers to know and to winnow that content to the most important content, and also to sometimes upgrade the sophistication of those graphics to make them journal-worthy. It's the ideal time to learn how to deal with journal guidelines and to how to use online platforms. So those are all great learning activities. It's also the perfect time to have people who have to read your work and give you comments. Once you exit your PhD program, you may or may not have that access to provide peer review of your manuscripts before they're submitted. But while you're a PhD student, you have a captive audience of helpers. They're assigned to you. It's part of their workload. They're going to help you, so that's the perfect time. While you're a PhD student is the time to learn about how to revise your own work, how the first version is not the last version of papers that you submit, and how to use feedback from others, how to incorporate that feedback, how to judge whether or not you really have to do certain changes or they would perhaps be nice in that person's opinion. It's also the time to learn how to revise manuscripts. If you get your first revise and resubmit decision after you're in a faculty role and you really don't have anyone to help you, it's much scarier than if you get that decision when you have an advisor and a committee to help you. It's also possible, if you're going to be an author, that you may occasionally get what I call deferral emails. Some people call those rejections. I tend to think of it, they're deferring me to another journal. But essentially they're saying, you're not putting that in our place, honey, that's not going to happen. And it's nice to get those first messages like that when you have help, when you have people to help you get through that experience. By the way, the WJNR editorial board special article for this year, where our editorial board writes their wisdom, is called Normalizing Rejection. It was just published last month, and it's useful if you have not yet had many rejections. Now, for some of us, we're quite experienced with rejections, but it was still helpful. So the PhD process, when you do a manuscript-style dissertation, is you learn a lot of skills, but you also come out with products. You come out with manuscripts. You come out with papers that are in press or maybe even published. So that is very helpful in that first position. But there are a few challenges to be aware of if you're thinking about the advantages and disadvantages. Probably the biggest hurdle is faculty resistance. By gosh, I wrote a 5-chapter dissertation and that's what all my students are going to do. You know, it's kind of, you raise your children like you were raised unless you're very intentional about it. So that can be a big issue in changing faculty's minds about manuscript-style dissertations. Many schools allow or require 4, 3, or 2 manuscripts as part of the dissertation. But usually you have to have a proposal as well. You have to have a written document about how you are planning your research. Usually you have to have that for IRB or perhaps for funding, so those are often included in the dissertation. A manuscript-style dissertation is not just the manuscripts. It includes the manuscripts, but it has other pieces. For some students, writing manuscripts is more difficult than writing a traditional dissertation because the skills are different. University formats may mean that some shifting has to take place. For example, our university, I don't know why they do this, they won't let us do a dissertation that has 4 different reference styles in the dissertation. Can you imagine that kind of a rule? Well, it does kind of make sense, but sometimes the manuscripts, one went to a journal that had a numbered system, another went to an APA journal, a third one went to a journal that had this bizarre system that they created just for themselves. But our university mandates that it has to have one style across the entire dissertation. As long as you're using bibliographic software, that's not a huge problem. But keep that in mind as you're selecting to do a manuscript style. It's also possible that after you wrote the first manuscript, your focus might shift a bit. Some people write their literature review manuscript in their first year of their doctoral program, and then as they move through their doctoral program and have more experiences, the focus of their dissertation may change. And so that may require some additional work on their part. Another issue is the timing of dissertation manuscripts, and this has already been mentioned by Sue. The timelines for the college are not the same as the timelines for the journal. And you just have to keep that in mind. Occasionally, not very often, but maybe once every other year, I get an email from a student who says, I need to have this manuscript accepted in 2 months or I won't be able to graduate. And my reply is, well, good luck, honey, but look elsewhere. Well, I don't say it that way. But that's essentially the message, because we still do our peer review process for every manuscript. And that's a process that sometimes it's done in 30 days, sometimes it's done in 20 days. Sometimes it's not done for 90 days if one of the reviewers has a crisis in their own life and delays their review. So just keep in mind, if your university or college have timeline rules, that those are not the same as the journal's rules. Dissertations, at the last day when you defend your dissertation and it's put in the whatever format that university requires, can include manuscripts at various stages. It could include those that you're planning to submit, those that are in review at a journal, those that are accepted for publication, as well as those that maybe already been published online or published in print. All of those different stages could be manuscripts in the dissertation. The journal and dissertation manuscripts, again, there's a lot of overlap, but there are some things that are distinct. Just because the dissertation committee thinks the manuscript is God's gift to science doesn't mean the journal reviewers are going to see it in the same way. So it's important that you go through your dissertation committee first, if you're a student, before submitting to the journal. The opposite is also true. Just because the manuscript reviewers think this is fabulous and your paper is accepted for publication, that doesn't guarantee that your dissertation committee is going to have the same opinion. So you need to be working both processes, and your dissertation committee should be your first process so that they are on board with your product. Publishers want to publish new information. They don't want to publish a paper that's already widely available. So students should avoid putting online their entire dissertation manuscripts prior to publishing those in journals. You can put online abstracts. Usually an abstract of 250 words or less that reports the same study is considered fair use, but not the entire manuscript. Publishers generally allow you to put manuscripts that have been accepted or published in your dissertation, but generally they don't want you to put in the version that was actually published. They ask you to put in the last version that was accepted by the journal, but not the actual copy edited and made pretty version of it. If the manuscript has been accepted by a journal, then that needs to be really clear in the dissertation. What I suggest students do is, after the title of that chapter, put an asterisk at the bottom of the page, indicate the full citation for that paper, or that it's in press at a particular journal. This is a topic that has been mentioned previously, but I just want to reiterate it. There's a difference between a paper that demonstrates great learning on the part of a student and a paper that creates new knowledge. And a paper that creates new knowledge is publishable. A paper that demonstrates great knowledge may have an A+++ grade, but it might not be appropriate for publication. So as a student, how do you know the difference? You talk to other people who are working in that area of research. You talk to your advisor and your committee and ask them honestly, does this create new knowledge? Is this paper new knowledge that I should be able to publish this? Or is there a part of the paper that creates new knowledge? And that's often the case. The paper both documents students' learning as well as creates new knowledge, so it needs to be extensively revised to become a manuscript. It's great for students to publish. Students sometimes ask me, do I need to say in my manuscript that this was my dissertation or my master's thesis? The ones I love are the undergraduates that say, do I have to say in there that I did this as my BSN project? I said, it has to rely on the quality of the paper and the quality of the research. But it is a special thrill to publish a paper from an undergraduate student. But you don't need to label that, because the papers are going to be judged on the quality of the research and the quality of the paper. Okay.
And I'm your last speaker. My name is Elaine Miller, and I'm going to talk about strategies for publishing literature review articles, which I'm assuming a lot of PhD and DNP students do. I'm also editor of Rehab Nursing, and I'm also section editor for Stroke. So I am involved with an interdisciplinary journal. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to be here with you today. And I also want to give you hope. My distinguished colleagues have done a great job of outlining what we need to do. And I too am going to have words of wisdom for you to think about. But as we've all known, we've all been rejected, correct? We all, if there's a will, there's a way. But there is really a method and a strategy for all this. So I hope I too can add and impart some wisdom to you and confidence to forge ahead. My objectives are the major types of lit reviews, and I'll also describe essential elements in publishable scholarly literature reviews. And a couple things that I need to make mention is, number one, new and novel. Everyone really said that it's really important. We only have so many pages each one of us has per year. And so we need new and novel ideas. And sometimes people have absolutely outstanding manuscripts, as Rita and Vicki mentioned, but it's nothing new. And you're probably that way. Have you ever picked up a journal and like, I know this? So you really want to impart things that are new and different. The other thing that's important is we do look at impact factors. So all of us would agree that we're interested in how many citations we get per article, because we are in competition with each other. We hate to admit it, but that's true. As are all the 11,000 other journals, not just nursing, throughout the arena. And the other thing that we do typically, and no one's mentioned, but we do run, I am published by Wiley, and we use Authenticate, so I always get a plagiarism reading before I even look at something. And so one of the things that you need to remember is if you're taking content, it's really important you correctly reference it, because we do have systems that we can tell. And so if you have a high plagiarism count, I know for me, it's not good. I'll throw it back to you, and I'm assuming the same is true with all of you. So, and I know you get excited and you forget, you go on the internet and you forget where the source came from, but keeping track of those references are really pivotal as far as moving forward. Now, given my time, there's tons of lit review types. So what I'm going to do is focus on the ones that you're probably more predisposed to do, and give you some words of wisdom again in terms of how to move forward with this. The other thing is to speak up to timelines. A lot of us have real rigid timelines for production. For instance, my July, August is already in production. Is yours also? So we work ahead. We also have excellent reviewers that we use. So when you submit a manuscript, we try to match. Most of us have at least 3 reviewers per manuscript that comes in, and we pick experts to review that content. So it's really important to us to have good reviewers, because we want to champion whatever journal we're doing to have the best possible articles available. Now, one of the ones that I made mention to you is an integrative review and a narrative review, which a lot of PhD, DNP students prepare. And basically what you're trying to do is get a broad view of what is known about a topic. And just as with your dissertation or DNP capstone, that question is really pivotal. And I know with my students, they come up with a question and then they get into the literature and it needs to get revised. And we know that. But basically with an integrative review, you're looking at empirical and non-empirical data. You're trying to get a world view of what's going on relative to that topic and what's the state of the science related to that topic. It helps you look at concepts and theoretical literature. It helps you look at methods, as we've already mentioned, and theories and research. So it gives you a sense of what's out there. Hopefully when you do this integrative review, you're going to find a niche that nobody's done, or they haven't slanted it quite the way you want. And that's the important component related to an integrative review is, you know, some students come back to me and they're like, oh, I can't find anything. And I'm like, this is exciting, because if there's nothing out there on your topic, that's a good entree, unless you searched with keywords inappropriately. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's important you get the right keywords. And I wanted to give you some examples, and these are real articles that were published. This integrative review was by Bronson, Zimmerman, and Young, and it was Journal of Clinical Nursing. And I need to make a commercial with journals. You know, part of the strategy for getting published is picking the right journal. So I'm of the opinion that 95% of your success rate is picking the right journal and putting it in the right format and rewriting. Because when you write, wouldn't you all say, ladies, there is an art to writing, and the more you write, you rewrite. Would you all say you rewrite, ladies? Yes. Yes, so we all rewrite. So we like to write, we're adept at writing, but we too have multiple drafts in most instances. Sometimes we can nail it one time, wouldn't you say? But most of the time we need to fix it. There'll be a couple typos or something. But this example was to examine the interventions used to improve self-care to heart failure patients. And the important part with an integrative review, this is a real article, is looking at the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So you can see what they used, PsycInfo, Cochrane, CINAHL, so they really had a particular perspective of how they were putting these pieces together, the years that they were really reviewing the content, and these were all important pieces. And then they actually ended up with 19 articles. They used Melnick and Feinholt, Overholt. Now, the important issue is when you're doing an integrative review, and I actually, in my excitement to be here with you, the first point about empirical and non-empirical research, Whitmer and Naffel are one of the ones that people typically use as a framework for the integrative review, but there are others like Pompey. Whitmer and Naffel talk about problem identification, your lit search, your data evaluation, your data analysis and presentation, which is great. And a lot of people will refer to that in their manuscript. Other people might use Pompey or someone else. Pompey just talks about interventions, theory, preliminary data, and then synthesis. So they use a different framework. So part of the issue when you're doing your homework about an integrative review and you're starting to think about what's your question and what journal I'm going to go after, I highly recommend you go to those journals and you look. It doesn't mean you have to be a clone, because remember, you have to be creative and novel and new, but get a sense of what is their preference for these things. So as you're moving forward, you can get a sense of what seems to be more prevalent. Now, getting back to my point about quality appraisal, one of the things I know when I work with students, and sometimes I know they get tired of it, but it's well intended, is don't you, when you read an article, want to know the quality of the literature you're reading? So you really want to know what level of evidence is it, how rigorous is it, whether it's quant or qual. So this quality appraisal in an integrative review is really an important component. And typically what happens when you lay it out, and you'll have tables, is you'll have the author and the year in one column, maybe the purpose, the level of evidence or quality appraisal, and the conclusions. So you're going to create a table from your integrative review of the articles that you have identified. And as these ladies have already described, we don't like 15 tables. Maybe 4, wouldn't you say? I mean, I don't, 4, 5 maybe. I've had some instances where I told someone they had too many, they had 12, and they came up with 16, and I was not happy. So you need to pay attention to the author. Or to the editor rather, because we have, once again, so many pages that we can publish. So we can't deal with 16 or 17 tables. And I know with my journal, I think I have less pages than you do. Stroke doesn't, but they have a lot more. But I have to be cognizant of how many tables I have. And then you can see from the results here is they talked about cognitive behavioral intervention mechanisms were most frequently used to improve patient heart failure self-care. So you can see from this little abstract how they laid out the information. And a pivotal part with an integrative review, and in a moment I'll talk about a systematic review or meta-analysis, is the question. Lots of times students will come with what they think the question is, then they go to the literature and they discover maybe it's not quite that way. Or maybe I need to make it a different population, or I need to frame the concept in a different way. Have you ever thought you knew the literature and then you get into the literature and realize that they have different buzzwords or that was the buzzword 4 years ago, but today it's a different buzzword. And so being aware of that is just really important. And if you're a doctoral student, hopefully your committee will be helpful to you to keep you informed. But you also are in the driver's seat if you're working on your research trajectory to start energizing people and looking at, as you said, I think it was one of you said about slicing it in a different way. Everybody looks at it a different way, but you're now looking at it with new eyes and offering a different, rich perspective. Now, a systematic review and a meta-analysis, basically what I said with integrative, you're doing quant, qual, mixed methods, you're getting a sense, an overview of whatever you're looking at, you want to know what the gap is. A systematic review and meta-analysis is much more focused because with this, what you're doing is you're looking at particular studies and you're trying to have a reproducible method to search the studies, and you once again have inclusion-exclusion criteria. If you saw from the slide, I had certain years, I had certain keywords, so finding the right keywords to really then do your searches, whether it's in CINAHL or PubMed or whatever, would be really worthwhile for you to do. And the other issue is if you find a really great article, see what those keywords are, because that can really be advantageous to help you find other articles. And then once again, as you're building these sources of articles, paying attention to where are they publishing them, where are they publishing them most recently, and then that will give you a beginning point to know where you might want to go and look. So with a systematic review, you're really appraising the evidence, you're really focusing maybe on the interventions, you're really targeting it down. You're not as much into quant and qual, you're more into the quantitative domain of looking at what you're looking at. And the other important part, whether you're doing the integrative review or the systematic review and meta-analysis, is that synthesis. Because the difference between a master's student as they review the literature, a PhD or a DMP really synthesizes the literature, and so that's what we're really looking for, is that synthesis. We don't want broad statements. Wouldn't you agree, ladies? Lots of students will, or people will submit something and they'll say, cognitive and behavioral interventions are what you do. Well, we want to know, you had that sentence, but we would want more detail about what exactly does that mean. What about the timing? What about the dosing? What about the delivery method? So all these issues would be relevant. So we want the specifics. With a meta-analysis, my goodness, okay, you have statistical analysis with your outcomes. So you're really looking at that from a perspective. And one of the things that I wanted to offer to you that might be a valuable resource is Equator Network. You can go there and go to that website, and it gives you all kinds of rubrics for different kinds of designs if you're going to do randomized control trial, systematic reviews. Typically, in the information for authors, which we already talked about, a lot of us already say, if you're doing a systematic review, we want PRISMA. If you're doing a randomized control trial report, we want CONSORT. So we already tell you what we want. Such as Rita was talking about, they click on where they're going and it's kind of embedded there. Others, such as my journal, just tells you where to go. And you can go to these sites, and I'll show you a flow sheet in a minute, but it might be a 27, 28 point table that you actually have to make sure all the parts are there. And this is an example of a PRISMA, which you might not find exciting, but I do. It's really laying out what did you search, how did you search it, what did you include, what you didn't. So whoever reads that article has the trail of your decision making and how it went through. So that's typically one chart or figure that we definitely want if we're publishing those. An example of a systematic review is the one I gave you, is to examine the effects of physical activity and exercise interventions on BMI, subsequent physical activity, and psychosocial symptoms for obese adolescents 12 to 18 years. You can see what my parameters were in terms of what we were looking at. You had randomized controlled trials. Now, the thing I wanted to mention to you about systematic reviews, you have Joanna Briggs, she has a template that you can use. Cochrane has a template. There's other templates that will outline for you how you put together your systematic review. So you need to think about that. And this one, supervised intervention, has the most influence on BMIs. Makes sense. Now, because time is short with me, so we have time for questions, I'm echoing a lot of what others have said ahead of me. You need to have the best fit with your type of review. So part of the issue, it's got to be new, it's got to be novel. You need to make a decision which one makes sense. Is it going to be integrative? Is it going to be systematic? Or a meta-analysis? You have to do your homework. You have to go and look at that journal. You have to internalize those author guidelines. And if you're tired and weary, you get somebody else who can read them and remind you of what it's supposed to do. The other thing is, if the information author says Prisma or consort, you need to follow that. You also need a buddy. You need a friend who will be really honest and critical, tell you the good things, but tell you the things that need to be revised, because you need those critical elements, because we will look for them. And once again, when you say, ladies, if we want a Prisma and you have 20 steps, but you forgot the other 8, it's not going to help you. And we're not trying to be mean. We're trying to be, and I guess we sound prescriptive, but we're trying to be equal because we get a lot of articles in, and we really want the best of the best. So when you do the components and follow the directions, if it's supposed to be APA, it is an APA, then that's good. If it's in MLA, that's not good, when it should be an APA. The other thing is you need to be attentive to detail. It needs to be correct, because we do authenticate, remember, my journals do. Clear, it needs to be scholarly. Sometimes people use jargon or cutesy words, but if you want to be scholarly, you need to sound scholarly. It doesn't need to be boring, it can just be scholarly. It needs to be coherent, so it goes beginning, middle, and end, and it needs to be succinct. And here are some references, and I look forward to seeing you all in the future published. If there's a will, there's a way. And I've had no coffee. This is pure enthusiasm for what I do.
Okay, I think we are ready for questions. If you could step to the mic, that would be helpful.
I'm Judy Schlager, assistant professor from University of Illinois at Chicago. To our last speaker, please. I am about to embark on a lit review of a esoteric disease entity where neither has a lot has not been published on that. There are no consistently effective treatments for this disease condition. Given your presentation, do you recommend, and many of the treatments have been written up in case studies. Do you then recommend that I narrow my lit review to, the aim of the lit review to be reviewing the treatments that have been tried for this particular disease condition?
I think what I would do is try to
Elaine, could you try to restate the question first?
Sure.
It was kind of a long one.
Basically, what I hear you saying is that you have a topic where there's not a great, clear body of knowledge, correct?
Right.
And so you're trying to discern what is the best approach, how to structure this integrative review.
Yes.
And I've had the experience before myself. I actually was doing an integrative review on use of simulation for disaster training. And we didn't really find that much, what the population we were looking at. So I submitted it to a journal, and I told him what I was doing, and he wrote back and said, but there's not that much literature. And I'm like, well, that was the point. The point of my article was there's not that much out there, and of what's out there isn't very good. So what I would recommend with you is definitely, the framing of the question would be real pivotal. So how do you structure the question so it really is new and novel? And then maybe you're not going to have a lot of studies. Maybe you're only going to have 5 or 10. Just, you see what I'm saying? But you also need to scout out what journal might be most appropriate for that topic. And if you give me your card, I would help you brainstorm if that would help you.
Thank you, Ken.
Because trying to find the right journal and how to frame that question is real pivotal. And I don't know exactly what disease. What do you?
We'll talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But mostly
I
the
hope that
studies.
helps.
It does help because mostly the studies that have been done because the disease is so esoteric has been prevalence studies.
Right. Well, and I think
and
that,
some epi work.
Right, and I think that could be really interesting because you're stepping it up in a different direction and offering new knowledge. But you might get rejected like I did the first time. But I actually got published in a better journal because I learned. It's like what we talked about earlier. I got rejected and I was not a happy camper. But then I looked at what they said and I really reframed it, and it was a far better article. And it was actually published by Western Journal.
Thank you. She was deferred. She was not rejected. Next question.
I'll just mention one more thing, which is if you have a topic like that and you think that a program of research needs to move forward in the area, sometimes there's a journal that would publish a guest editorial. Now, you may not want to let everything out of the bag that because it's going to be your program of research and you don't want to tell the rest of the world what you're doing before you've submitted that proposal. But a lot of times, querying an editor that covers that area and seeing if, here's the state of the science and it's really lacking, and these are the steps or these are the areas of inquiry that would be particularly useful in moving the science forward in this area might be really useful. And those aren't peer reviewed. They tend to be reviewed by the editor. They don't count the same for tenure. I'll just mention that, but it's useful oftentimes for science.
Yes, over here.
Good afternoon. Is this on? Yes, okay. Julie Ponto from Winona State University in southeast Minnesota. Thank you very much for an informative session. This was very thought-provoking. My question relates to the decision regarding which journal to submit a manuscript to, and I often advise students to, as I think some of you mentioned or suggested, look at the common journals that are in the reference list of your most sentinel articles. And I think that's a good strategy. However, sometimes journals may perceive that they are sort of saturated on that topic, or that they've already published on a similar topic. So could you just comment about some of your thoughts and perceptions on that issue? Thank you.
So the question is about selecting a journal for a particular manuscript. I think anyone from this group might talk to that.
My response is, you don't always know what we have in the pipeline, so sometimes we actually reject really great pieces just because we know we have something in the pipeline we're going to publish in 2 months. So I think the thing is, if in fact you're concerned about that, it's once again how you frame it. If you're looking at, and I do a lot of work in stroke, modifiable stroke risk factors, but I frame it to African Americans, lower socioeconomic, or Asian, how can you slant it in a different way that makes it new and fresh? And I think that's an important part. Now, you don't want to lie about it. You have to actually be factual about it, because sometimes, no, seriously, sometimes people put things together. They have these really great titles, wouldn't you say, and they kind of purport that they're going to present something, and then when you read it, it's like, no, it doesn't fit. So just be honest and forthright.
I have 2 suggestions about finding a good match. The first is look at the editorial mission for journals that you're thinking about. We spend a lot of time putting those documents together to communicate to everybody what it is that we do, and so we really hope you read them. If you want to look at a broad range of nursing research journals, go to the INANE website. I don't know if all of you know INANE is the International Academy of Nursing Editors, but INANE hosts a journals directory that has links to a long list of journals, and you can get this information. The second point I have is query editors. That comes with a caveat. I love queries in advance of submission, and I spend a significant amount of time corresponding with authors and giving them advice about what I think they should do in terms of submitting to nursing research or not. And if I say not, I'll usually give a suggestion for where else. Not all editors like queries, though, and so if you don't hear back from somebody, it could be they just don't do that.
And I'll make one more comment. It seems like we're talking a bit about what was different from the first question, which is a lot's been done on this topic. I tell for all manuscripts, it is critically important that you say in the abstract and in the introduction the gap that is being filled. Let your reader know why This 20th article that we've seen on this topic, I should keep reading this. And so that helps the reviewers, but if it is eventually published, it really helps the readers as well.
And I would just say for the specialty papers that I talked about, when you're thinking about a concept analysis, so maybe there's been a lot of papers written that seem to have addressed the same concept, but a well-done concept analysis actually can clarify what that concept really means to us from a scientific point of view. Remember, whatever paper you're writing is designed to move science forward. So it should be doing that. So even if it seems like there are a lot of papers on a topic, if maybe it's not the same kind of paper that you've written, it hasn't addressed the same kind of issue, again, it's that uniqueness, that innovativeness that you want to think about. And in choosing journals, that I think that is critical. Look at what they've done. Do they publish those kinds of papers, not just those kinds of topics? Okay?
And on a related kind of suggestion, I suggest doctoral students and definitely junior faculty start what I call a hit list. It's my Excel file of all the possible places I might publish my kind of work. And in that file, I may have the link to their information for authors. And I have a few pieces of information that are really important to me, like word limits and table limits and style. And so you just build your list over time so that when you have a new manuscript, you have a ready list of possible places. Yes?
Hi, I'm Karen Patricia Williams from The Ohio State University, and I'm wondering if you can address, either of you, there are two schools of thought regarding publishing specifically for junior faculty, whether they should continue to hit the same journal over and over again. They've gotten success, and whether that's building their reputation, or if in fact they should go to different journals.
Okay, the question is whether or not someone should publish in the same journal repeatedly or should publish in multiple journals.
So I have a general rule of thumb, which is that any pub's a good pub. So that said, I think your question is actually well taken. I think a variety of journals are good. On the other hand, there's some folks who are working in very specialized areas, and the readership of certain journals make those journals very important for those kinds of authors. Because my other rule of thumb is put your stuff where people who need to read it will read it. And so we're researchers, but we want clinicians to read our work. So we need to put our work in clinical journals at the same rate at which we're putting our papers in high-level research, methodologically driven journals. And so I think there is just like there's a list of how to put together the types of journals that you might want to publish in, certainly there must be some variety on that list, right, Vicki?
Yes.
Yep.
I think Sue was going to add something. Or?
I was going to say too, it depends on your audience. I agree totally with Rita. It's if you are after clinicians, lots of times I'm after nurses, but at the same time I'm interested in physicians because I rehab PTs, OTs, different disciplines and interdisciplinary teams. So, and I think there's also, when you're young faculty and you're trying to get published, you want to have success. So I would start with journals where you're going to have more success and you become more adept. You might not want to go to a journal that has like a 15% acceptance rate. You want to start so you have success. You want to have mentors that will really help you review your manuscripts and help you get a step up. But I do think, if possible, diversity is nice, if it fits.
Maureen Green from a healthcare system here in Milwaukee and University of Wisconsin-Madison right now. But my question is, and Susan, you brought it up, it's regarding dissertation. And I'm pleased to see that the doctoral studies, some of the doctoral programs are looking for manuscripts while you're in school on the content that you're doing, concept analysis or otherwise. But sometimes dissertation is exhausting. It does look like an exercise of how to learn the dissertation process. And I thought that was a pivotal comment that you made, that sometimes the exhaustion you feel after dissertation is that you've just learned it and now you're uncomfortable with going to manuscript. And I was just wondering on that timeline, because even after the dissertation is written and you get a rejection and then time goes forward, is there any concept of how viable that, paper would be as time goes on? Let's say it's 2, 4, 5 years later, whatever.
Yeah, in general, I track data collection time really closely, and it's not an issue necessarily for dissertation research. It comes up a lot in secondary analysis. We ask for that information now with every submission. When data can get too old, they really do age out and they're no longer relevant. If we do continue to consider a paper where the data are older, always in a revise and resubmit, I ask authors to explain why should we still care about this, and especially a lot of our research is clinical research. How has practice changed, and how will that influence how you even think about the research problem in light of today? So I think it's not only students. I think students especially can get fatigued, but other investigators can also. But it does matter, and you shouldn't sit on data. You shouldn't think that you need to squeeze every last bit of information out of a data set. Get on with your life and do something new and different. I think that's a major problem that people, or an issue that, a decision that people make, and don't keep on the same project for 10 or 15 years. It's really just time for something new. I don't know if that helps.
And I would add to that, to decide up front which is the most important papers out of a project, not necessarily the easiest, and write the most important papers first, because you want to get those out first in case you do have fatigue and decide to quit.
So what I'm not clear about is when you have a new disease entity with not a lot published on, and you have oodles of data, because you perform many questionnaires, and you find important findings, but you can't present it all in one manuscript. It would get too muddied. So how many manuscripts can you get out of one study?
The question is about how many manuscripts out of one data set. And that's the question, and it's a complicated answer, so
Well, that's a good question, and there have been some recent editorials from the Inane group. Actually, the editors group have written some papers about that recently that are pretty interesting. And of course, there isn't an answer except it depends. I think you can look at your data in a variety of ways. To me, a study sort of stands together, and to a large degree, I think, to the extent that you can, it's a paper. But sometimes studies are quite extensive, and they may have very different aims that can be addressed in different papers. Editors get concerned about a lot of papers coming out of the same program of research. Again, that Authenticate picks up a lot of overlap between previously published papers. Then we have to go ask the authors to tell us about how those papers are really different from each other. I think you can think sometimes in this way. Maybe you have 3 aims and they're fairly distinct. That may be 3 papers. Maybe the aims are close enough that you have perhaps a paper on methods and you have a paper on results. Perhaps you have some long-term outcome for some of your aims that makes sense to address differently from the primary or earlier outcomes that you were measuring. So I really think you have to look at your work and think about what those papers are going to be in a very much in an a priori manner before you have all of your data and everything all together. You need to be thinking ahead of what that's going to look like.
One comment that I would make is if you can use the same introduction for two different papers, it's probably one paper. If it's the same background section in literature, then probably it should be in one paper.
Karen Carlton, Children's Hospital of Wisconsin and UW Milwaukee. Can you state what an average number of revisions we should expect? I've heard a lot of people say, 2, but sometimes if you get asked to do a third revision, should you start to think maybe I need a different journal?
So the question is about the number of revisions for a journal, and what's a typical number, and is there an outlier number, I think is the question. Comments?
One of the things that I would recommend, and I meant to, but when you get feedback, you really want to make a chart to say, here's all the comments, and here's how I responded, and please bold it, or somehow let us know in the revision where it is, because it gets really frustrating if you don't, because we can't find it. But it just depends. I mean, most of the time, maybe 2 or 3 times, it depends. Sometimes they develop a section and that section's good, and then another section they didn't address. It just depends. I would say, for me, usually 3 times. But if I'm going to reject it, I might give you an option the first time if I think it needs some work. And if I see that you're making progress, but it's not going to be there, I'll probably reject it then. So I try not to let it go on and on, but sometimes it's like they don't have IRB and suddenly it appears, and they have something that suddenly appeared that I wanted, and I'm like, is this for real or was this made up? Because sometimes people do that.
One comment, a decision to revise and resubmit is not a decision to accept eventually. So I just want to get that out there. My experience has been that if we go beyond 2 revisions, the authors and I tend to get into a sort of a circus that I think may be counterproductive for both of us. Sometimes I go beyond 2, but not usually.
I just have a quick question about secondary analyses. Are they frowned upon in that my mentor, I did a secondary analysis, and she said that I should have, kind of identified everything the first time around.
So your question is about secondary analysis of your own data set?
Yeah, in another publication.
I don't frown upon secondary analysis if the data supports and the way that that measurement was done, looking at it with a fresh perspective, fresh questions, that it's really worthwhile. So I think, we are spending all this time and effort collecting this data. So I think very often secondary analyses are appropriate. But I think, the question you ask yourself at some point when you're in the same data set and you're continuing to do studies from that is, I've got to move this program of research forward. And if I'm stuck in the same data set, at some point, I'm really not doing that. You can't stay in that same data set for too long, because that should be moving your program of research forward with new questions that require new measures, new groups, whatever.
And as with many things, transparency is essential. In any subsequent manuscripts, you cite the previous manuscripts, so it's very clear it's the same data set. We're going to have to stop due to time, and I'm very sorry about that, but we really appreciate your questions and your attention, and perhaps we can talk with you individually. Thank you.